Sarah Bennett pulled into the parking lot of Jefferson County Courthouse at precisely 9:15 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning. She did not look like someone who owned half the commercial properties in downtown Jefferson. Simple blue jeans, a white plain shirt, comfortable walking shoes. Her usual outfit when going around to inspect her properties. The morning had started like any other. Sarah woke up at 5 a.m. She loved living simply in her modest three-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, which was worth millions. As her mother had taught her long ago, real wealth was not about showing it off. It was about making a difference in society. As Sarah walks toward the courthouse steps, she couldn't help but smile into the irony of the situation. Just last week, her company had bought this very building in a silent move through a private holding corporation. It became her newest acquisition as part of a plan to revamp the city's infrastructure without raising rents on government offices. The parking ticket in her hand was for a mere $50, which she had received 2 weeks ago when one of the downtown meters had malfunctioned. Sarah had tried calling the clerk's office to explain, but they had insisted she appear in court. She had photos of the broken meter on her phone and all the necessary documentation. It should be a simple matter to resolve. Several people rushed past her on the courthouse steps. Most of them were wearing suits and carrying briefcases. A few nodded politely, not recognizing her as the owner of numerous buildings they worked in. Sarah preferred it this way. At 35, she had built her real estate empire quietly, letting her work speak for itself rather than broadcasting her success. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning hit her face with a blast of cold air. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the echo of footsteps bounced off the high ceilings. Sarah checked the notice again. Courtroom 3B, Judge William Harrison presiding. While waiting on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, Sarah observed the people around her. A young mom wrestled with a crying infant. An older man nervously shuffled through papers, and 2 teenagers whispered quietly to each other in the corner. She pulled out her phone and reviewed for one last time the photographs of the broken meter. At exactly 10 a.m., the BFF opened the courtroom doors. All rise for the Honorable Judge William Harrison. His voice boomed through the room. Sarah stood with everyone else as a tall, gray-haired man in black robes strode to the bench. Judge Harrison's reputation had made him known for being strict traditional, and as some whispered, not altogether fair-minded. When dealing with some of the defendants, Sarah sat silently through a number of cases before hers. She saw how Judge Harrison dealt with each one with different degrees of patience. He was unrealistically soft with a young, white college student who was caught speeding, but openly irritated with a Hispanic man who had trouble with his English when explaining his traffic violation case. Number 247 Sarah Bennett parking 6 violation, the clerk finally announced. She realized it was her turn. Sarah stood up and strode confidently up to the podium, holding of all that documentation. She could see the way the judge's expression changed as he raised his head from his papers and met her. His eyebrows narrowed, his mouth compressing into a thin line. Miss Bennett, he drawled the last word, dripping with condescension. You're here on a parking ticket on Oak Street, October 15th. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah said meekly. I have proof that the meter was not working that day. Plenty of people had the same, Miss Bennett. While she was speaking, the judge's face dropped, his mouth tightening into a fine line. The citation distinctly states that your meter expires at 2:15 p.m. Are you saying our city's machinery is broken? Sarah tried again. Your Honor, if you will just look at these photographs, I've heard enough defenses for today, Judge Harrison said, cutting her off. Once more his voice carried a subtle hint that most in the courtroom recognized. He had already made up his mind. What Judge Harrison didn't know as he sat on high in his bench, staring down at Sarah Bennett in her plain gown, was that this particular case would soon be the talk of Jefferson County. He didn't know that the meek and mild woman who was standing before him owns not just that house, but the land it stood on, as well as many in the city. Sarah sat patiently, waiting for what would come next. Years of business negotiations had taught her patience. Sometimes you needed to let things play out in order to truly bring about change. And what would transpire in the next few minutes would set off events so profound and transformative, not just for Judge Harrison's career, but for the entirety of the Jefferson County justice system. Judge Harrison shifted forward in his chair as he looked down at Sarah with cold, calculating eyes. The courtroom was silent except for soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers. Everyone can feel the building tension in the air. Miss Bennett, Judge Harrison said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Perhaps you don't understand how things work in my courtroom. We all waste time with excuses about broken meters. He picked up her file and made a show of flipping through it slowly. Sarah remained calm, though her heart was beating faster. She had dealt with people like Judge Harrison before, people who saw what they wanted to see and made rash judgments on looks. She attempted to give him one last shot to try and explain. Your Honor, I have pictures that clearly demonstrate the silence. Judge Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom. Several people in the audience jumped in their seats. I will not tolerate interruptions in my courtroom. Sarah noticed how he sounded more lighthearted, as if nothing out of the ordinary was going on compared to just 15 minutes ago when he had allowed a young white man to expound on his case for nearly 10 minutes. The two tones couldn't be any sharper, and she wasn't the only person who noticed. The court reporter had stopped typing. And was this your third parking violation this year? He looked at her sternly. Did not know that other tickets already dismissed. When Sarah showed the same meter broken. Actually, Your Honor, Sarah spoke carefully, those previous citations were dismissed. Because did I give you permission to speak, Judge? Harrison's face was turning slightly red. He turned to his clerk. Show me M. Bennett's record. The young clerk, Amy, hesitated for a moment. She had seen dismissed records, but didn't seem to want to say anything against the judge. Sir, the prior citations, never mind. The wave of his hand dismissed the point. Miss Bennett, your blatant disrespect for the laws of our city's parking regulations, continued disregard for authority. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged worrisome glances. Even the babe, who had worked with Judge Harrison for years, looked uncomfortable. Sarah straightened herself and squared her shoulders. She was used to being underestimated in business meetings, but this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment in this courtroom. Besides, Judge Harrison continued shuffling papers on his desk. Your casual attitude today shows a lack of respect for this court. He looked disapprovingly at her jeans and comfortable work shirt, not knowing she had already inspected 3 building sites that Ming. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. She had signed the papers finalizing her purchase of the courthouse building just last week. The deed was probably still sitting on someone's desk in the county clerk's office. Given your history and attitude, Judge Harrison declared, clearly enjoying his moment of authority, I am imposing a fine of $5,000. A gasp went through the courtroom. Even the other court officials looked shocked. The standard fine for a parking violation was $50. This was clearly excessive, Your Honor. Sarah began, her voice steady despite her growing anger. I would like to appeal this decision. Judge Harrison smiled coldly. You have that right, of course, but take note that an appeal will incur court costs on your fine now. Is there anything you'd like to say before we settle this? Sarah looked around the courtroom, and she saw anxious faces of others waiting in line for their turn. She saw the court reporter, who stopped her typing, staring into her computer as if she was in shock. She saw Amy, the clerk, biting her lips not to utter some nervous talk. No, Your Honor, Sarah said in a hushed voice. I think everything that has to be said will come out soon enough. Judge Harrison missed the understated meaning in her words. He was already reaching for his gavel, ready to move on to the next case. Very well, pay the fine within 30 days or face additional penalties. Next case. As Sarah turned to leave, she caught Emmy, the clerk's eye. The young woman mouthed, I'm sorry, when Judge Harrison wasn't looking. Sarah gave her a small, knowing smile. Walking out of the courtroom, Sarah pulled out her phone. She had a meeting with the county commissioner in exactly 1 hour, a meeting about renovation plans for this very courthouse. Sometimes she thought justice works in strange ways. The truth about who really owned the Courthouse was going to be discovered, and Judge Harrison's world was going to be turned upside down forever. Sarah walked down the courthouse hallway, the unfair $5,000 fine notice clutched in her hand. She checked her watch. It was 11:30 a.m. And her meeting with County Commissioner James Thompson was at noon. A small smile played on her lips as she headed toward the courthouse cafeteria to grab a quick coffee. The cafeteria was busy with the usual mix of courthouse employees, lawyers, and visitors. Sarah stood in line, overhearing snippets of conversation about what had just happened in courtroom. 3B word was spreading fast about Judge Harrison's excessive fine. Did you hear about that parking ticket case? one young lawyer whispered to. Another $5,000 for a parking violation. That's insane. Classic Harrison chat. Ting colleague replied, shaking his head. He's been getting worse lately. Someone needs to report him to the Judicial Review Board. Sarah paid for her coffee and found a quiet corner table, pulled out her phone, and called her assistant Michael. Could you bring the courthouse renovation plans to my meeting with Commissioner Thompson? And yes, everything is going exactly as we expected. Meanwhile, back in his chambers, Judge Harrison was feeling quite pleased with himself. He sat in his leather chair, eating the sandwich his secretary had brought him to lunch. A knock on his door interrupted his meal. Come in, he called out, mouthful of turkey sandwich. Emmy, the court clerk, entered nervously. Judge Harrison, I think there's something you should know about the Bennett case from this morning. What about it? He asked, barely looking up from his desk. Sir, I checked her rec more thoroughly. Those previous tickets were all dismissed with evidence. The meter on Oak Street has been malfunctioning for months. The city's maintenance records confirm it. Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. It no longer matters now that the fine has been set. She will think twice before disrespecting my courtroom again. Amy hesitated before speaking again. There's something else, sir. I saw her name on some documents that came through the county clerk's office last week. But before she could finish, Judge Harrison's phone rang. It was the county commissioner's office requesting his presence at a meeting at 12:30 p.m. The secretary repeated as they went back to the cafeteria. Sarah finished her coffee just as Michael arrived with a thick folder full of blueprints and documents. Perfect timing, she said, standing. Let's head to the commissioner's office. Commissioner Thompson's office was on the top floor of the courthouse, with large windows overlooking the city. As Sarah and Michael entered, Thompson greeted them warmly. Miss Bennett, so glad you could make it. I have been excited to review your plans for improving the building. Gestured for them to sit in the comfortable chairs facing his desk. Sarah spread out the blueprints on the commissioner's large desk. As you can see, we're planning to modernize while preserving the historical character of the building. The first phase includes updating all the courtrooms with better acoustics and new technology. They were deep in discussion when another knock came at the door. Judge Harrison entered, then stopped short when he saw Sarah. Sitting there, his face went pale. Judge Harrison. Commissioner Thompson said, brightly, perfect timing. I wanted you to meet Ms. Bennett properly. She's the new owner of the courthouse building. She's planned some wonderful improvements to your courtroom. Judge Harrison was standing frozen in the doorway, his mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Sarah turned to face him, her expression professional, composed. Judge Harrison and I have already met, she said calmly. In fact, he just fined me $5,000 for a parking violation at a meter that the maintenance records show has been broken for months. Commissioner Thompson's eyebrows shot up. $5,000 for a parking ticket, yes. Sarah continued, her voice steady. It was quite an interesting experience seeing how justice is administered in the courthouse. I now own. The color had fallen from Judge Harrison's face when reality finally set in. This woman he had treated so dismissively less than 2 hours ago wasn't just any citizen. She was his new landlord. I believe, Sarah added, turning back to the blueprints, that courtroom 3B will be the first to receive renovations. We'll need temporarily relocate those proceedings, of course. Judge Harrison remained standing in the doorway. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The day that had started so normally had just taken an unexpected turn, and he had a sinking feeling this was only the beginning of his problems. The news spread through the Jefferson County Courthouse like wildfire. By 2 p.m., everyone from the janitors to the most senior judges knew what happened in Commissioner Thompson's office. The story grew with every telling. How Judge Harrison founded the very woman who owned the building in which they all worked so unjustly. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers. His hand was shaking as he poured his third cup of coffee that morning. His head was going over and over the events of the morning. How quick he had been to judge Sarah Bennett. How sure he was of his authority. And now everything is falling apart. A knock on the door made him jump. It was Chief Judge Martinez, his supervisor. Bill, we need to talk. Chief Judge Martinez said, closing the door. Behind him, his face was serious. I've received 3 calls in the last hour about what happened this morning. The local news is asking for comments. Judge Harrison slumped in his chair. I didn't know who she was, he said weakly. That's exactly the problem, Martinez replied sharply. You shouldn't treat anyone that way regardless of who they are. $5,000 for a parking ticket. What were you thinking? Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her downtown office. Reviewing emails were coming in. Local civil rights groups were requesting a meeting with her. Others who felt similarly victimized in Judge Harrison's courtroom were calling to tell their stories. Her assistant, Michael, tapped and entered with a pile of papers. "Miss Bennett, the courthouse maintenance records you asked for are here. 8 times in the last 3 months that meter on Oak Street has been reported broken." Sarah nodded as she flipped through. "And the tape of this?" Michael replied, setting a flash drive on her desk. The security cameras caught everything in the courtroom. The court reporter also faxed over the official transcript. Back at the courthouse, Amy, the clerk, was busy pulling files from Judge Harrison's previous cases. She had been keeping notes for months, worried about the pattern she saw in his rulings. Now finally someone might actually listen. Judge Harrison's secretary knocked on his door again. "Sir, there's a reporter from the Jefferson Daily News Online. When they're running a story about this." An incident told them no comment. He snapped, then immediately afterwards regretted the harshness of his tone. He was beginning to understand how frequently he spoke that way to people. 3:30 p.m. Sarah had another meeting. This time it was with her lawyers. They sat in her conference room, reviewing the events of that morning. "Clearly, the fine was excessive," said her lead attorney. "But more important, we found a pattern of similar behavior in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The data shows significant disparities in the way he treats different defendants, based on race and appearance." Sarah gazed out her office window at the Courthouse building across the street. "This isn't about revenge," she said pensively. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Meanwhile, back in chambers, Judge Harrison was entertaining another visitor. His old friend and fellow judge, Robert Chinbill. Judge Chin said, sitting down heavy, "I've been your friend for 20 years. I gotta be honest with you, what happened today. It's not an isolated incident. We've all seen how you treat certain defendants differently." Judge Harrison started to protest, but Judge Chun helped hold up his hand. "Listen to me. This is your wake-up call. You can either learn from it, or it can be the end of your career." Late afternoon, Sarah received a call from Commissioner Thompson. "Miss Bennett, the Judicial Review Board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're requesting your presence." "It'll be there," Sarah replied. "And Commissioner, please make sure Judge Harrison knows that my plans for renovating his courtroom haven't changed. Sometimes the best way to fix a broken system is from the inside out." As the sun set over Jefferson County, Sarah and Judge Harrison sat in their respective offices reflecting on the day's events. For Sarah, it was another step in her quiet mission to make a difference in her community. For Judge Harrison, it was the beginning of a painful but necessary lesson regarding justice, prejudice, and the consequences of judging a book by its cover. The real changes were just beginning, and the next day would bring even more surprises for all parties involved. The next morning, the Jefferson County Judicial Review Board met in their top-floor conference room of Courthouse 7, were seated around the big oak table. At its head was Chairman David Roberts. The room was tense, waiting for Sarah Bennett's arrival at exactly 9 a.m. This time, Sarah walked in dressed professionally in a navy blue suit. There was no mistake about her position of authority. Her lawyer, Jennifer Martinez, woke up bigger, carrying with her a thick folder of documents. "Thank you for coming, Miss Bennett," Chairman Roberts said as he gestured to an empty chair. "We've called this emergency meeting to address yesterday's incident and some broader issues which now seem to raise their head." Just then, Amy, the court clerk, entered with a trolley laden with files. "These are all the cases from Judge Harrison's courtroom over the last year," she explained, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been tracking the trends." The board members looked at the mountain of files with a mix of concern. SS lawyer stood up and began distributing reports she had prepared. "What you're receiving," Jennifer explained, "is a statistical analysis of Judge Harrison's rulings over the last 12 months. Data shows clear patterns of bias in his sentencing." Chairman Roberts put on his reading glasses and studied the first page. His frown deepened. "According to these numbers, Judge Harrison gives fines averaging 200% higher to minorities compared to white defendants for the same violations." Down in his chambers, Judge Harrison sat alone, waiting. He hadn't slept well, spending most of the night thinking about his actions. His phone kept ringing with calls from reporters, but he ignored them all. Sarah's voice was calm as she addressing the board. "Yesterday's incident over my parking ticket is not about me. It's about every person who walked into that courtroom and got treated unfairly. The board members listened as Sarah played them the security footage of the previous day. They watched Judge Harrison's dismissive behavior, his interruptions, and his excessive fine. Then they watched footage from other cases showing the stark difference in how he treated different defendants. "Disturbing," said board member Janet Shun, shaking her head. "But worse, nobody caught it or seemed to check on it for all that time." Emmy spoke again, and a number of us realized we were too afraid to say anything. Judge Harrison has a tremendous amount of clout here. During the middle of the meeting, Commissioner Thompson burst in with some more evidence. "We have obtained the maintenance records for that parking meter," he declared. "It was called in broken several times." Judge Harrison knew this and did nothing with the information. Sarah rose and went to the window, overlooking the city. "I'm not here to demand Judge Harrison's removal," she said, surprising everyone. "I'm here to propose a solution." She turned back to face the board. "As the owner of this building, I have plans for renovations. But maybe we need to renovate more than just the physical structure. Maybe we need to change how justice is administered here." The board members exchanged glances. Chairman Roberts leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Bennett?" "A complete overhaul of the system," Sarah replied. "Mandatory bias training for all court officials, regular review of sentencing patterns, and a new community oversight committee. I'm willing to fund these programs myself." The room was silent as everyone digested her comments. Finally, board member Michael Wong spoke up. "We should also review all of Judge Harrison's recent cases. Some people might deserve refunds or appeals," added. Sarah nodded. "And I want to be part of that process." As the meeting continued, word spread through the courthouse about what was happening. Employees gathered in small groups discussing the changes that might be coming. Some were nervous, but by noon, many were optimistic. The board had made a number of decisions. Judge Harrison would be temporarily suspended pending a full investigation. All of his recent cases would be reviewed, and most importantly, Sarah's proposed reforms would be implemented. As Sarah left the meeting, she passed by Judge Harrison's empty courtroom. Through the window, she could see his vacant judge's chair. Sometimes she thought it's the biggest changes that start with the smallest incidents, something as minor as a simple parking ticket. The real work was only just beginning in Jefferson County. Courthouse House would never be the same again. Judge William Harrison sat alone in his home study, staring at the suspension letter from the Judicial Review Board. The morning newspaper lay on his desk, its headlines screaming, "Local judge under investigation. Years of biased rulings exposed." His phone had been ringing nonstop for the past 2 days, but he hadn't answered a single call. His wife, Linda, knocked gently on the study door before entering with a cup of coffee. "Bill," she said softly, "you need to eat something. You've been sitting here since yesterday." He looked up at his wife of 30 years, seeing the concern in her eyes. "How did I not see it, Linda?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, I thought I was being fair." Linda sat down across from him. "Remember what your father used to say about Judge Matthews back in the 60s, how he treated your Irish immigrant grandparents in his courtroom?" The memory hit Judge Harrison hard. His grandfather had lost his small business because of Judge Matthews' unfair ruling. He had promised himself he would never be that kind of judge. Yet here he was decades later, doing the same thing to others. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Amy, the clerk, was working late, helping the review team go through Judge Harrison's old cases. Each file told a story of subliminal bias. Higher fines for minorities, stricter sentences, less patience during hearings. "Look at this one," Amy said to Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's lawyer. "A young black man got 6 months for the same offense that a white college student got community service for just last month." Sarah Bennett walked into the room, carrying takeout dinner. "For the team, how many cases have we reviewed so far?" "Over 200, Jennifer replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "The pattern is clear. In almost everyone back at his house." Judge Harrison finally decided to watch the security footage from his courtroom that the board had provided for 6 hours straight. He watched himself in case after case. He saw his expressions, heard his tone, noticed his different treatment of defendants based on their appearance and race. In one video, he watched himself interrupt at Hispanic mother trying to explain her situation, while in the next case, he patiently listened to a white businessman for nearly 20 minutes. The contrast was painful to watch. Later in the evening, Judge Harrison's daughter Rachel, a law student, came to visit. She found him still in his study, surrounded by case files he had brought home. "Dad," she said, sitting next to him, "my professor used one of your cases as an example in class today, not in a good way." He looked at his daughter, seeing the disappointment in her eyes. "I bet you down have an IU can still make it right," Rachel responded, "but first you have to really understand what you did wrong." Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her office, going over the suggested changes for the courthouse. The drawings for structural improvements now also called for a new community justice center in which regular training for bias and fair treatment would be given to judges. Her phone beeped as she saw that it had received a text from Linda Harrison, the judge's wife. "Miss Bennett, my husband would like to see you not to make excuses, but to listen and learn. Would you be willing to give him that chance?" Sarah stared at the message for a long time. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. This was about real change. And sometimes that meant giving people an opportunity to learn from their mistakes. She typed a reply. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. call him in my office. Tell him to bring the notes he's surely been making while reviewing his cases that night." Both Sarah and Judge Harrison lay awake in their respective homes, thinking about the meeting ahead. For Sarah, it was another step toward her goal of improving the justice system. For Judge Harrison, it was an opportunity to begin making amends for years of unconscious bias. The next day would bring either the beginning of real change or the final end of Judge Harrison's career. Everything depended on what he had learned from his time of reflection and whether he was truly ready to change. The transformation of the justice system in Jefferson County was about to enter its next PH at exactly 9 a.m. Judge William Harrison was standing outside the office building of Sarah Bennett. His hands still trembled as he clutched a thick notebook full of his observations from reevaluation of his past cases. He had hardly slept, having spent most of the night jotting down each and every instance of bias he found in his rulings. The security guard at the front desk looked at him with recognition. "Miss Bennett is expecting you, Judge Harrison." 15th floor. The elevator ride seemed to take longer than usual, and when the doors opened, Sarah's assistant, Michael, greeted him. "Please follow me, Judge Harrison. Miss Bennett is ready to see you." Sarah's office was simple but elegant, with large windows offering a view of the courthouse across the street where Judge Harrison had spent 20 years. She stood as he entered, gesturing toward a chair opposite her desk. "Thank you for seeing me, Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison said, his voice more subdued than anyone had ever heard it. "I don't think you owe me any favors." Sarah studied him carefully. The arrogant judge of a few days ago was gone. In his place sat a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his realizations. "Judge Harrison," Sarah began, "I didn't agree to this meeting to hear apologies. I want to hear what you've learned from reviewing your cases." He opened his notebook with trembling hands. "I spent the last 3 days watching videos from my courtroom and reading through my old cases. The patterns are clear now. I was harder on minorities, quicker to interrupt them, less likely to believe their explanations." Sarah listened without interrupting as Judge Harrison went through specific cases, names, dates, and details of where his bias had affected his decisions. "There was Maria Rodriguez," he said, his voice cracking. "She tried to explain that she was late to court because her child was in the hospital. I fined her $500 for contempt. The very next day, I accepted a similar excuse from a white defendant without question." Tears formed in his eyes as he continued. "And James Washington, a young black man who got 6 months for a minor offense that I usually gave community service for. These are just 2 examples out of hundreds." Sarah took out her own folder. "We've been reviewing those cases too, Judge Harrison. What do you think should be done about them? They all deserve new hearings," he replied without hesitation, "and I've written personal letters to each person I treated unfairly, admitting my bias and apologizing. They're all in." This folder, he placed another thick envelope on her desk. Sarah raised her eyebrows, genuinely surprised. She hadn't expected him to take such initiative. "But that's not enough," Judge Harrison continued. "I want to do more. I've enrolled in bias training courses and am working with civil rights organizations to better understand the impact of systemic racism in our justice system for the first time since the meeting began." Sarah smiled slightly. "That's a good start, Judge Harrison, but what about the future? What happens when you return to the bench?" Judge Harrison straightened in his chair. "If I'm allowed to return, I want to implement a system where all my rulings are reviewed every month for bigotry, I have to work with community leaders, and he caught himself taking a deep breath. I have to be a mentor of young judges, so they never make the same mistake as me that I did. Sarah stood up and walked to the window looking out at the courthouse. Judge Harrison, when I bought that building, I didn't buy property. I bought the chance to construct a change. Your circumstances have led us to the chance to overhaul the entire system. She turned to him. I'll support you to the bench under certain conditions. You'll be working with our new community oversight committee. You'll be participating in regular bias training, and most importantly, you'll help us implement these changes across the entire courthouse. Judge Harrison nodded eagerly. They'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Good, Sarah said, because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about building a justice system that actually serves everyone equally. As Judge Harrison left Sarah's office that morning, he felt both humbled and hopeful. He had been given a second. It was a chance not only to save his career, but to be part of something that would finally bring real change in the system he had served for so long. The transformation had started both in Judge Harrison and in the Jefferson County justice system. 3 months had elapsed since Sarah Bennett's meeting with Judge Harrison. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a different place. Now workers were busy renovating the building. But the biggest changes were not in the walls. They were in the people. On that particular morning, Judge Harrison stood before a packed courtroom. But he wasn't sitting on the bench. Instead, he was teaching a group of judges, lawyers, and court staff about recognizing unconscious bias. Last year, I would have denied having any prejudice, he said to the attentive audience. Let me show you exactly how bias can creep into our decisions without us even knowing it. In the back of the room, Sarah watched with satisfaction. Action. The man speaking was nothing like the arrogant judge who had fined her 3 months ago. His hair had more gray now, but his eyes showed wisdom that hadn't been there before. Emmy, the court clerk, raised her hand. Judge Harrison, what's the biggest change you've noticed in yourself since the training began? Harrison smiled thoughtfully. I listened more. Really listened. Yesterday, a young man came in for a traffic violation. In the past, I would have rushed through his explanation. Instead, I learned he was driving his sick mother to chemotherapy. That context mattered. Meanwhile, in another part of the courthouse, the new community Oversight Committee was meeting. The committee created by Sarah included people from all parts of the community: teachers, social workers, former defendants, and civil rights activists. The numbers are encouraging. Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's lawyer, reported to the committee. Over the last 3 months, we've reviewed over 500 old cases. More than 200 people have received refunds for excessive fines, and 50 cases have been reopened for new hearings. Back in the training session, Judge Harrison was showing video clips from his old court sessions, comparing them with recent ones. The difference was striking. Watch how I interrupted this woman 6 times in 2 minutes, he said, pointing to an old video. Now watch a similar case from last week. Defendant speaks freely, and justice is better served because of it. During the lunch break, Sarah met with Commissioner Thompson in the new courthouse cafe, another of her improvements to the building. The changes you and Judge Harrison have made are spreading, Thompson said excitedly. 3 other Corps of houses in the state have inquired about instituting similar training programs. Sarah nodded, stirring her coffee. That's good news, but we're just getting started. Next week, we'll be starting the Youth Justice Program. And the Youth Justice Program was one of Sarah's last projects. It would bring some high school kids in to learn about the justice system and do some mock trials. Judge Harrison had offered to spearhead the program later that afternoon. A familiar face showed up in the courtroom of Judge Harrison: Maria Rodriguez, the woman he had so unfairly fined several months previously. This time, she was there to join the Community Oversight Committee. Welcome, Mrs. Rodriguez, Harrison said warmly, stepping down from the bench to greet her. Your perspective will be invaluable to our committee. Maria looked surprised at his friendly manner. Thank you, Judge Harrison. My English is still not perfect. Your English is fine, he assured her. And we now have court translators available whenever needed. That's one of the many changes Ms. Bennett helped us implement. At the end of the day, Sarah walked through the courthouse observing all the changes. The walls had fresh paint, but more importantly, the halls were filled with new faces. People from all parts of the community, even now, felt welcome in their courthouse. She passed by Judge Harrison's courtroom one last time. He was still there, reviewing cases with a young law student intern. Remember, she heard him say, justice isn't just about following the law, it's about seeing the human being in front of you. Sarah smiled to herself. The parking ticket that had started all this was framed in her office now, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments. As she left the building, she saw a group of community members entering for the evening's public forum, another new initiative. The courthouse was no longer just a building where justice was served. It had become a center for community transformation. The story of the judge and the courthouse owner had become a symbol of change, not just in Jefferson County, but in courthouses across the state. Sometimes true justice starts with one person willing to learn from their mistakes and another person willing to give them that chance. 1 year had passed since the day Sarah Bennett walked into Judge Harrison's courtroom for a simple parking ticket. The Jefferson County Courthouse was celebrating its first anniversary of the Justice Reform Program, and the main hall was packed with all types of individuals. Sarah stood at the podium, overviewing the crowd. In the front row sat Judge Harrison himself with his family to his side, Maria Rodriguez-Emi, the clerk, along with many others who had been part of this amazing journey a year in the past. Sarah started to speak. Her voice was clear, strong, and concise. I walked into this courthouse as just another person getting a parking ticket. Today we gather here to celebrate something much bigger than one person or one episode. The courthouse walls spoke for themselves. New signs across the doors in several languages greeted visitors. The halls featured artwork from local artists illustrating scenarios of justice and community. Each courtroom now had interpretation services and cultural sensitivity advisors. Judge Harrison, currently Chief of Judicial Training, addressed his audience next. He also looked different from last year, more unassuming, more approachable, and definitely wiser. "Last year, I made a mistake that could have ended my career," he said honestly. Instead, thanks to M. Bennett's vision, it became an opportunity to create real change. "We helped other people learn from my mistakes." Numbers spoke for themselves as posted on a big board where the year achievement stood. 1,000 cases reviewed and corrected, 300 judges in court staff, trained in bias awareness, 50 community programs, launched 5 other COR houses adopting their reform model, 0 complaints of racial bias. In the past 6 months, Maria Rodriguez stepped forward to tell her story. "A year ago, I was afraid to come to this courthouse," she said, "clearly having improved substantially in English now I help other people feel welcome here. This is what real justice looks like." Amy, who had since been promoted to Chief Court Administrator, introduced the next stage of their program starting next month. "We're opening the Youth Justice Academy. High school students will learn about law and justice from Judge Harrison and other reform judges." In the audience, local news reporters took notes. The Jefferson County Courthouse had become a national model for justice reform. Visitors from other states regularly came to learn from their example. Sarah watched as Judge Harrison's daughter, Rachel, now a newly graduated LA lawyer, talked about the legal clinic she was opening in the courthouse. It would provide free legal help to people who couldn't afford lawyers. "My father's experience taught our whole family about the importance of fair justice," Rachel said. "Now I want to help make sure everyone has access to it." Near the end of the ceremony, a surprised a visitor, the mayor of Jefferson City. He brought with him an official proclamation declaring this day Justice Reform Day in the city. "What has gone on in this courthouse over the last year proves that change is possible," the mayor declared. "One parking ticket led to a complete transformation of our justice system." Judge Harrison walked over to Sarah, holding something in his hands. It was a framed copy of the original $5,000 fine he had given her. "I keep this in my chambers," he said in a hushed tone. "It reminds me every day to look past my assumptions and to see living, breathing flesh and blood standing before me." Sarah smiled and reached into her drawer and pulled out her own copy of the same ticket, which she had framed in her office. "Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places," she replied. As the celebration continued, stories were told of the courthouse's impact on their lives. A young man spoke of his second chance through the new rehabilitation program. A grandmother talked of the new translation services that helped them work through the courts. The day concluded with a community dinner, and the people from every imaginable background were sitting together, sharing food and stories. Judge Harrison sat with Maria Rodriguez's family, learning Spanish from her children. Sarah watched it all from a quiet corner, just feeling proud about what they had done. The parking ticket that had set it all in motion was but a memory, but its reverberations would still be felt in generations to come. The Jefferson County Courthouse had become much more than a building. It was a shining symbol of how justice, truly blind to color and status, could transform the entire community as the sun set down in the celebration. Sarah knew this was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter in their journey onto true justice for all.